Rome, 1501, allegedly. In a Vatican apartment lit by candles and painted with saints and gods, a night unfolds that later writers would call the Banquet of Chestnuts. A papal master of ceremonies, Johannes Burchard, recorded a scene of courtiers, clergy and courtesans, a spectacle that still ignites argument. Was it fact, propaganda, or something between? At the center stands Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare, symbols of power at its most raw. This story isn't only about scandal, it's about how authority, belief and image collide inside the world's most watched church. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. You're crouched, at least in imagination, behind a marble column, the stone cool against your palms. Incense drifts through the corridor like a ribbon, sweet at first, then heavy, almost medicinal. From the next room comes a bright clatter of laughter and glass, then a hush, the kind that makes a candle's little crackle sound loud. Frescoes glow along the walls, classical heroes and Christian martyrs sharing the same painted sky, while somewhere a door snicks shut. You're not here to gawk, you're here to test a claim that has lingered for centuries. Did a pope preside over a night that turned prayer into theatre? To answer that, we have to meet the people who could turn Rome's whispers into law. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia in Spain, rose with speed, wealth and a talent for the possible. His court looked like a chessboard set with gold. Sons promoted, allies rewarded, opponents coaxed or crushed. His gifted second son, Cesare Borgia, began as a cardinal in scarlet silk and ended in armor, riding at dawn through captured towns. Both men knew how influence worked in the 15th century. Doors open for those who hold the keys, and the keys rarely stay clean. But accusations, even famous ones, need a witness. Ours is Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, an official whose job was to stand close enough to the throne to record how power moved, who entered, who bowed, who spoke, and when. In the spare Latin of his diary, often called the Liber Notarum, he described processions and councils, but also dinners and entertainments, with the tidy calm of an accountant. That flat tone, so free of flourish, has persuaded many. Yet historians still argue over whether later hands edited passages or whether enemies of the Borgias amplified them. Tonight, we'll note what's reported and what remains in doubt. The report says the setting was Cesare's apartments inside the papal palace. Imagine high ceilings stained with candle smoke and walls freshened by a fashionable painter. The guest list, again according to Burchard, mixed power with curiosity. Cardinals who preferred to be seen as worldly, nobles with favors to trade, diplomats who took mental notes. What followed, the diary says, wasn't a simple supper. It was a performance with rules, prizes, and a theme. Chestnuts, humble, seasonal, easy to scatter, became props under flickering light. We won't dwell on the body. This is not that kind of show. We will, however, explore why such a scene, if it happened as written, would strike the nerve of Europe. Because beneath the candlelight was a larger question burning. Faith depends on trust. Politics depends on spectacle. When spectacle overtakes trust, institutions wobble. Alexander's reign already stirred anger, charges of simony, lavish patronage, family-first strategy. A night like this, reported, debated, impossible to forget, offered critics a banner to wave. It did not, by itself, cause the upheavals that reshaped Christianity, but it colored the way many saw Rome, not as a city of saints, but as a stage where saints were scenery. So our journey will move in two directions at once. We'll travel backward to the dust of Spain, where Rodrigo Borgia learned how a signature could change a life. We'll follow his children into arranged marriages, cardinalates, and campaigns. We'll stand at the Tiber's edge when a body is found, and hear, for a moment, the language of reform in a grieving pope's mouth. Then we'll return to this apartment where a contested night supposedly unfolded. And finally to the aftermath. New popes, new rooms, new art, meant to declare a cleaner age. Along the way, we'll keep the ledger straight. Who said what, who doubted it, and what the doubt itself reveals. If you listen closely, you can hear why the story survives. It isn't just the spice of gossip or the thrill of hypocrisy. It's the uneasy realization that power often dresses itself in the garments of virtue while reaching, quietly, for something else. That tension between what we say we honor and what we actually do echoes far beyond the Vatican. It touches courts, companies, movements, and sometimes our own choices. That is why a disputed diary entry from 1501 still finds breath on modern lips. A candle sputters as if short of air. From the next room a soft cheer, then the scrape of chairs. Whether the moment that follows deserves infamy or merely suspicion, we will treat it with care. The marble is cold, the voices are warm, the truth is somewhere between, ready to step out from the column and see what the record, such as it is, will allow us to see. The road begins far from Rome, in the dry light of eastern Spain. Rodrigo de Borgia, later known to Italy as Borgia, was born in Játiva, near Valencia, where summer heat pressed figs sweet and the church bells measured time like a careful bookkeeper. In this town, a boy learned that power could be counted, signed, and sealed. When Rodrigo's uncle, the ambitious Alfonso de Borgia, ascended the papal throne as Calixtus III in 1455, the family name turned from a surname into a key. A door swung open. Rodrigo walked through. He did not shuffle. He stepped. At 25, he wore the scarlet of a cardinal deacon, a position many men reached after decades of service. Rodrigo reached it with a mix of ability, charm, and favor. People called it nepotism, from nepos, nephew, and in that century the word was less an insult than the common tongue of advancement. The church was not only an altar, it was a map of offices and incomes. Rodrigo learned the map. He mastered it. Paper became his landscape, bulls and briefs, dispensations and distributions. In Rome's crowded curia, Rodrigo's desk grew heavy with benefices, church incomes attached to far-off towns he might never see, but he could count. A signature here, a recommendation there, a discreet gift to the right household at the right time. His web spread until it hummed with coin. He did not live like a monk. He lived like a Renaissance prince who happened to wear a cleric's hat. The difference mattered to some. To Rodrigo, the duties still got done. He could balance a ledger and preside at Mass, host a banquet and negotiate a treaty before the candles burned low. It was not all ink and candles. The man loved and was loved. In Rome, he formed a lasting relationship with Vanozza de Catane, a Roman gentlewoman who understood the city's rooms as well as any cardinal. With her, according to multiple chronicles, he fathered children who would become pieces on a larger board. Giovanni, Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Goffredo. To modern ears, that sounds like a scandal announced by trumpets. To many of Rodrigo's contemporaries, it sounded like something else. An open secret, regrettable on paper, manageable in practice, and common enough in an age when vows were preached loudly and kept unevenly, Rome noticed. Some admired the competence and the polish, others kept lists of complaints. In 1460, Pius II is said to have rebuked Rodrigo for conduct unworthy of a prince of the church. The letter, often summarized by later historians, reads like a father's scolding. "You are too public with pleasures. You have made Siena talk." Rodrigo's answer was not to retreat. He simply became more careful about doors and footmen. The work continued. So did the rise. By the late 1480s, he had become the Curia's great broker, a man who could smooth a border quarrel in the morning and arrange a favorable appointment by evening. To ambassadors, he was the cardinal who returned calls. To rival cardinals, he was a formidable vote-getter, a man whose alliances reached into every faction. He cultivated artists and jurists, hosted dinners where silver caught firelight, and made sure that guests left with the sense that they had been heard. Rome is a city of listeners. Rodrigo listened well. Then 1492. A year that changed more than one world. In August, with the Sistine Vault still blank and the streets tense with speculation, 23 cardinals entered conclave to choose a new pope. Italy smelled of dust and oranges and fear. On the second day, the smoke signaled decision. When the doors opened, Rodrigo de Borgia emerged as Alexander VI. To critics, the outcome proved what they had always said, that simony, the buying and selling of sacred office, had soaked the process like spilled wine. To supporters, Alexander was simply the best organizer, the ablest mind, the steadiest hand. The city celebrated, torches climbed the 7 hills, and young men danced in the squares. People forget that part, but the record is there. Rome welcomed him with the noisy warmth it reserves for the strong. Alexander paid them back the next morning with what Romans trust most, order. He cleaned the streets, forced the city's violent families to heel, and made Tuesdays famous for justice. On that day, petitioners knew the Pope would listen. Nothing in his early months looked like a portrait of ruin. Quite the opposite. The candles burned bright. The incense was sweet. At home, in the maze of Vatican chambers, where servants move like veins, another project took form. Alexander cherished his children. He said their names as a father does, with softness at the edges. But he positioned them as a statesman, Giovanni to titles and lands, Cesare to the church's red silk, Lucrezia to marriages that stitched maps together. Cynics called it corruption. He called it prudence. In an age when alliances were the difference between a city and a ruin, the family was the surest fortress. So the stage stood built. A pope with a Spanish spine and Roman manners, a court that glowed with competence and whispered of appetites, a family whose future rode on placements and promises. The incense hung in the air a little heavier now. The candles burned lower. Somewhere in a ledger a line was drawn that no one would see until it was too late. By daylight, Rome looked every inch the city of saints. Pilgrims climbed the worn steps of basilicas with hands that knew farm work and needlework better than travel. They came from the Alps and from the plains, from little towns where the church tower was the only arrow pointing up. In the nave of St. Peter's, their whispers braided into a single sound, a quiet faith that asked for blessing, not explanations. Incense rose in soft ropes. Light crossed mosaics in a way that felt like mercy. But cities keep 2 clocks. When the sun slid behind the Janiculum and shadows filled the alleys, Rome changed suits. Lanterns blinked awake over market stalls. Dice clicked on tabletops, theatre troupes and musicians wandered. Courtesans in silk moved with a confidence that comes from knowing the price of the night. None of it was new. Ancient stones had seen worse and better. What felt different under Alexander was how close the 2 Romes lived to each other, how often the same men left a chapel and crossed a square toward pleasures as if walking from one room of a house to another. Money greased the doors. A world of favors grew around the papal court, and favors have a way of inventing paperwork. A cousin seeks a canonry. A prince wants a legate to rule in his dispute. A city needs a tax eased because the harvest failed. Each petition arrives with a letter, each letter with a visit, each visit with a gift, and soon the corridors feel like the busiest street in the world. The etiquette is ancient and exact. Do not speak too soon. Do not speak too late. Remember the names of footmen. They remember yours. The word indulgence deserves a pause because modern ears hear only the thunder. In that age, an indulgence was a formal remission of temporal penalties for sin. granted under specific conditions: confession, contrition, almsgiving, works of piety. Announced in certain seasons and years, it was meant to be medicine for souls. Reports from the Jubilee of 1500 describe crowds so thick you could cross a street on shoulders. The intention was devotion. The effect sometimes looked like commerce. When coins collect in boxes and preachers sharpen their pitches, rumor grows that salvation has a price tag. Critics did not need to invent their case. They only had to describe the optics. This is not to say Rome had no holiness. It had plenty. Monasteries prayed while the city slept. Confraternities cared for the ill. Poor women lit candles for sons lost to war, and widowers knelt for wives taken by fever. Holiness lived like an underground river, pushing up in fountains where you least expected it. But power has a stage, and what people remember is what plays under bright light. The stage now belonged to men like Alexander and Cesare, and to the circles that fed them news, money, and faces. A visitor walking the city carried 2 cents from church to square: incense and tallow. The first clung to clothes after a long mass, the second to the air, where candles guttered in gaming dens and backrooms. You could tell the hour by which smell was stronger. In palaces along the Tiber, long tables glowed with silver. Men argued art and borders. Women moved the same arguments with a glance. Laughter rose late, and sometimes did not sound like joy. The city's moralists wrote sermons that named no names, and everyone knew the list. Into this tapestry stepped the Borgia style: rich fabrics, strong gestures, and a flair for turning a dinner into a negotiation. Alexander loved theatre, the safe kind with actors and scripts, and the dangerous kind where the actors did not know they were acting. Pageants went up for feast days. Hunt parties rode at dawn. Poets found patrons. Musicians found employment. The Pope's apartments began to serve as both chancery and salon, a place where an evening's entertainment could soften a week's hard verdicts. If all this sounds like a city bent on pleasure, remember the daggers. In narrow streets, feuds burned between families whose names a porter whispered like a prayer to avoid trouble. Contracts had a way of ending disputes that oaths could not. The word assassination had not yet become modern shorthand. It still tasted of spice roots and Eastern stories, but the act itself, a man on the ground, a sword quickly cleaned, was as Roman as the stones. The church tried to keep its lines clear. Bishops preached. Friars heard confessions until their ears rang. Orders wrote rules. Yet even holy men live in cities built by other men, and sometimes the rule was simply, be careful, be useful, be seen. That rule reached all the way into the Vatican, where the master of ceremonies kept his notebooks, and the Pope kept his schedule, and the servants kept their counsel. When power and piety share a wall, the mortar between them is made of human habit. Here, then, is the double life in full, a city that knelt by day and bargained by night. A papal court that promoted justice in the square and reputation in the salon. A ruler who could silence a street gang on Tuesday and smile at a poet on Wednesday. The candles burned down, the servants trimmed the wicks. The smoke lifted into frescoes where saints and mythic heroes appeared to share the same painted air. The effect was beautiful. The effect was troubling. Beauty can make trouble easy to forgive. At the edge of this beauty stood chestnut sellers, their braziers crackling in the autumn lanes. The little nuts were cheap food for working people, hand warmers for boys, a seasonal comfort in a city that prized seasons. No one looking at a street vendor in October 1501 could guess that chestnuts would later be blamed for a night's infamy. But history has a talent for turning small objects into symbols. You pick one up. It smells of smoke and sweetness. You put it in your pocket, not knowing what it will mean. Family is the factory where reputations are forged. For Alexander VI, family was also a foreign ministry, a treasury, and a cavalry unit he could deploy without summoning troops. He loved his children in the old way. Food on the table, rooms prepared, tutors hired, portraits commissioned. He used them in the new way, titles for bargaining chips, marriages for bridges, offices for leverage. Both truths can live in one house. Giovanni Juan, the eldest son, wore his youth like armor. Alexander made him Duke of Gandia, a title that sounded fine in Rome and even finer in Spain. Giovanni was handsome in the way that makes older men hopeful and older women nervous. He hunted too hard, spent too freely, and carried himself like a man who trusted the future. He could be cruel, people whispered, and careless in a city that punishes carelessness. But he was the Pope's first hope for a lasting line. Hope can make a father blind at noon. Cesare, the second son, was different. Cool where Giovanni was hot, calculating where his brother was game. He entered the church not as a calling, but as a corridor. The scarlet of a young cardinal looked good on him, and looked even better on the family plan. One son to lands, one son to curial power. In that arrangement, the map of Italy began to seem less like a puzzle and more like a meal, which piece to cut first, which to save for dessert. Then there was Lucrezia, born into a world that measured girls by dowry and destiny. She learned languages and music. She learned how to sit in a room with men and listen without appearing to listen. People who never met her wrote pages about her as if they had taken tea together in her dressing room. She was called an angel and a serpent by the same pen in the same season. The reason was simple. Lucrezia was useful to other people's stories. She married Giovanni Sforza, a tie to the powerful Sforza clan, and later, when politics reshuffled the decks, she married Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie. These were not fairy tale choices, they were bridges. In a century of bridges, some burn. The Pope managed these lives like a conductor with too few rehearsals and too much audience. In the Vatican apartments, letters left by the handful, sealed with red wax and streaked with urgency. A courier's boots could mean victory or delay. One week the talk was Ferrara, the next Naples or Milan. Alexander spoke most often the language of pragmatism. What is possible? Who can be moved? What will it cost? On feast days, he spoke of God. On weekdays, he spoke of maps. The court watched. Ambassadors reported home in careful cipher. The Pope favors this house, the son courts that captain, the daughter's dowry is a spear aimed at a border. Some of those dispatches read like suspense novels. A name appears 3 times in 4 weeks, then vanishes, then returns with a new title. The story breathes hard, then settles. It is common, reading them now, to imagine that people were puppets and destiny the puppeteer. But individuals made choices within their narrow corridors, and sometimes those choices surprised their principles. The Pope was powerful. He was not omniscient. If you stand beside Lucrezia in imagination, the room changes. She is not the caricature the centuries gave her. She is a young woman who can speak with grace to ambassadors and kneel dutifully in chapel, and who knows that both gestures are part of the same chess game. When her marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled, official reasons cited impotence, unofficial reasons cited politics. Either way, a bridge was dismantled and rebuilt elsewhere. Such maneuvers leave smoke even when no fire is intended. Gossip filled what documents refused to say. For Giovanni, the armor of youth cracked along the river. In 1497 he did not come home. Boatmen on the Tiber found a body. The city inhaled and did not exhale for 3 days. Alexander grieved in a way that made even enemies pause. He spoke of reform, of tightening the court's morals, of stepping back from the edge where gold and appetite meet. For a moment the Vatican smelled like a sacristy after Easter, all new candles and clean linens. Then the moment passed. A father's pain hardened into a policy of survival. He had other children to protect and a conspiracy to outlast. Cesare felt the hinge turn. The church had suited him, because it served him. When it no longer did, he turned the garment inside out and found steel beneath the silk. His pivot to the sword belongs to our next section, but the resolve is born here, in a house where mourning and calculation shared the same table. He looked at Italy and saw opportunity in the kaleidoscope of duchies and communes, condottieri and communes, French claims and Spanish anxieties. He saw that a man with nerve could carve a state from confusion the way a sculptor finds a figure in a block. In quieter corners of the apartment, Goffredo, the younger brother, moved in a smaller orbit. His life a reminder that even in famous houses most children live off stage. Servants who grew old in Borgia service would later tell their sons that the family could be kind as well as ruthless, playful as well as plotting. Both are true. The music at supper did not stop because treaties waited in the antechamber. Stand still and the motifs return. The incense of a mass said for a dead son. The candle guttering in a room where a daughter signs her fate. A chestnut warming in a vendor's pan outside the palace gate while a secretary drafts a letter that will change a province. None of these objects know their future. People rarely do. They carry on as families do, believing that tomorrow can be managed if tonight's letters go out on time. The chessboard looked secure on the night the pieces were set. But in chess, as in Rome, a single move can rewrite the value of every other piece. The Pope believed the board was his, the city believed otherwise, and the city in time is usually right. The river keeps its own counsel. In June 1497, boatmen on the Tiber skimmed dawn's pale light and saw what none of them would ever forget. A young man's body snagged against the reeds, water slicking hair to a familiar brow. Rumors say the throat was cut, the clothes stripped, and 9 wounds spotted along shoulder and torso. Details repeated, embellished, disbelieved, then repeated again. As Rome does with any story big enough to move a city, it was Giovanni Borgia, Duke of Gandia, the Pope's eldest son, the bright first hope of the Borgia line. The news crossed Rome faster than prayer. Servants told porters, told guards, told courtiers, told ambassadors, and the whispers climbed the palace stairs until they reached Alexander VI. For 3 days, the Pope shut himself away. He wept, he would not eat, he would not sleep. The court that had learned to read his face saw something new, grief that could not be stage managed. Even enemies softened their expressions. Death levels a room. In that chamber the air smelled not of incense but of sweat and wax, the odor of a candle that has burned too long. Alexander's words turned toward reform. Listeners heard promises. The court would be cleansed, simony curbed, concubinage checked, discipline restored. He summoned cardinals and lawyers, demanded drafts, asked for ordinances that would make the Vatican feel like a church again. For a moment, sorrow translated into policy. Messengers ran, scribes scratched, and an old idea that a pope might be reborn by pain walked the corridors like a new hire. But grief is not a governor, it is a weather system. It breaks, and people go back outside. By autumn, the drafts that had seemed like thunderheads thinned to a fine mist. The men who had cheered reform now cheered a victory in Romagna or a new alliance in France. Rome's calendar insisted on business, and business, under Alexander, meant the family calculus resumed, only colder now, as if the loss had burned away sentiment and left the wiring of survival exposed. The city, hungry for narrative, asked the obvious. Who killed Giovanni? Talks in back rooms tied the crime to rivals, to lovers, to underworlds, to politics so tidy they looked like fiction. Some dared to name Cesare as suspect. Others rejected the slander as envy, sharpening itself into a knife. The truth, if one truth ever existed, stayed underwater with the weeds. The papacy made no official villain. Rome supplied a rotating cast. What did change, undeniably, was the angle of Cesare's gaze. Even before his brother's murder, he wore the church like a tailored coat, flattering, useful, not quite his skin. After the Tiber, the coat felt tight enough to split. You could see it in the way he watched soldiers drill in courtyards, in the way he folded maps, in how long he sat with captains who sold their swords to the highest bidder. The scarlet of the cardinal began to look like a warning flare for something harder to extinguish. Lucrezia felt the chill too. In the rooms where she smiled and poured wine and read the air like scripture, she measured every whisper against future storms. Her marriage strategies, first Giovanni Sforza, then Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, were no longer simply bridges, they were breakwaters. The sea kept rising. At Giovanni's funeral mass, incense finally returned, thick ropes of it rolling up to a vaulted ceiling, coating the throat, putting a formal scent to private ache. The Pope's shoulders bent, the choir carried a sorrow wider than the nave. Outside, the chestnut braziers popped in the morning air, a crude little comfort for a city suddenly aware of its own pulse. Vendors called soft to passers-by, "Calde! Calde!" as if warmth could be handed over like a coin. No one knew what the chestnuts would mean later. For now, they meant only that life goes on, even when a dynasty stops to count its dead. When the mass ended, the candles guttered in their brass, the smoke thinned, and the papal household returned to lists, letters, and logistics. Reforms faded into the drawer where good intentions nap. The Tiber flowed, as it always would. Rome breathed out. In 1498, a rumor hardened into fact. Cesare Borgia resigned his cardinal's hat. Rare then, rare now. He stepped out of the church's scarlet and into armor as if changing rooms. The decision wasn't a tantrum against theology. It was a calculus about power. In an Italy mapped by jealous duchies and opportunistic kings, a man with speed, money, and a pope for a father could carve a principality out of hesitation. He moved quickly. Louis XV of France sought papal help in untangling a marriage. Alexander sought a continental partner. Cesare sought backing, titles, troops, legitimacy. Somewhere in the triangle of need, hands met. Cesare married French, wore French favor like a cloak, and rode south with the ruthless courtesy of a man who thanks you for your city while taking your gates. The Romagna became his proving ground. Town by town he demanded fealty with a velvet invitation and an iron deadline. Governors who mistook his grace for weakness learned otherwise. Some surrendered at first parley, seeing the arithmetic. A quick oath kept their lives and preserved their ledgers. Others hedged. Cesare didn't. The campaign knitted together a swath of territory that had been a patchwork, more rumor than realm, into something that looked like a state. Taxes flowed, roads were patrolled, bandits found themselves surprised in the dark by men who did not tire. What made him frightening wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was efficiency. List a problem, and he would remove not only the obstacle but the excuses. Councils met on time. Captains knew their paydays. Judges understood that graft would be punished when discovered and expected to be discovered. In one notorious episode, repeated by chroniclers with relish, he invited quarrelsome captains to a reconciliation and left the hall with fewer quarrelsome captains than he had entered with. The message was not subtle. It didn't have to be. When Machiavelli later admired a prince who could be both fox and lion, he wrote with a man like Cesare in mind. None of this meant that Cesare ceased to be a Borgia. The family emblem beat in every dispatch. Alexander VI fed the machine with appointments and revenues, expanding the College of Cardinals. Critics counted the new hats like accountants count sins, and turning the papal pen into a lever. Letters flew like arrows. Some stuck, others fell. Enough hit their mark to keep Cesare's war chest heavy and his legend heavier. In the towns that bent the knee, not everyone wept. Merchants like stability. Peasants appreciate a road that is safe at sunset. Priests prefer a chapel no longer caught between two taxing lords. Yet even satisfied men flinched a little when Duca Valentino, Cesare's French-styled title, rode past. His calm looked like thought, his smile like choice withheld. You felt that fate near him was less a wind than a grip. The church watched the transformation with divided eyes. To some courtiers, Cesare's secular pivot proved that the Borgias had always treated religion as costume. To others, it proved that modern princes required modern methods and that piety without teeth merely fattened wolves. Alexander, who had once dreamed of two sons ruling two halves of the world, one in silk, one in steel, now watched a single son become both. Pride and worry sat side by side in his chair. At night, after victories and treaties, Cesare returned to apartments that glowed with candlelight. Musicians tuned, the table glittered. The Pope presided with the comfort of a patriarch who had learned to turn feasts into policy. There were entertainments, some ordinary, some extravagant, all of them useful. Guests left having laughed, or pretended to, and having promised what they would later try to renegotiate. The machinery hummed. The city, which measures men the way a money changer measures coin, found itself impressed in spite of itself. This is the corridor that leads toward the Banquet of Chestnuts, not a leap but a walk, step by step, from victory to celebration, from celebration to spectacle. From spectacle to a night, the city could neither forget nor prove without argument. Whether Cesare conceived it as theatre, test, or simple excess is a matter of endless debate. What matters for us is how very plausible such a night would have seemed inside rooms, where politics and performance had ceased to be separate nouns. Outside those rooms, an autumn vendor tipped a pan of chestnuts and smiled at the hiss. Smoke rose like a memory. Inside, men who had changed maps in daylight rehearsed how to change reputations by candlelight. The phrase arrives with a hush, the Banquet of Chestnuts. It reads like a fable title, a fairy tale for cynics. Our principal source is the diary of Johannes Burchard, papal master of ceremonies, a man whose job placed him close to power and whose prose was famously flat. According to entries attributed to him in October 1501, often aligned with All Hallows' Eve. Artist of 31, though the exact date is debated, Cesare Borgia hosted a lavish entertainment in his Vatican apartments. The guest list mixed cardinals, nobles and diplomats with performers and courtesans. The evening, says the record, moved from formal supper to staged spectacle. The details that follow have been contested by later historians. Some argue interpolations, others exaggeration, so we will tread carefully, naming what is claimed and what is plausible. Picture the room. Frescoed walls by a fashionable hand, the air thick with candle smoke, the marble floor gleaming like a stage. Servants clear trenchers and set candelabra not only on tables, but on the floor, shifting light into low theatres of gold and shadow. Musicians measure a rhythm steady enough to walk by and slow enough to watch each step. Guests converse in the ease of men who believe themselves insulated by rank and walls. Then the theme, chestnuts, seasonal and ordinary, scattered across the floor between pools of light. Performers begin a choreographed game, dancing then as wine loosens edges, crawling to gather the nuts one by one. Accounts describe clothing thinning by degrees, not as shock but as progression, each moment more intimate with the audience than the last. The staging turns the simplest movement, reaching, balancing, collecting, into a test. The room watches. Some laugh too loudly, some smile without showing teeth, some pretend to find it all terribly clever. Power likes its entertainments to double as loyalty checks. Burchard's record claims prizes, silk tunics, shoes, fine caps, for gentlemen who proved themselves most industrious in intimate contests with performers. Servants, the diary says, kept scores, marks on a ledger or chalk on a wall. If it happened as written, the point was not merely indulgence, It was display, the public conversion of private appetite into theatre under papal eyes. The account places Alexander VI present, with Lucrezia nearby, facts so scandalous that critics made careers of repeating them and defenders dedicated pages to disputing them. Some modern scholars accept Burchard's basic outline as characteristic of late Renaissance excess, while questioning specific claims, numbers, positions, who precisely watched what. Others question the entire scene as later propaganda dressed in plausible clothing. Our narration holds the claim at arm's length. We dim the camera. We keep the lens on hands and light. A chestnut lifts from marble. A candle's halo flutters. A servant's quill scratches a notation. A cardinal's ring catches gold. We hear laughter like coins hitting a table. We do not film bodies. We are not here to trade titillation for history. What we do examine is meaning. If such a night occurred in essence, if not in every tally and gasp, it tells us how spectacle can become policy. Bring moral risk inside the palace, and you invite your allies to share the risk. You make them complicit, and complicity is a strong glue. Refuse the invitation, and you mark yourself as a problem. Accept it, and you will keep secrets for the rest of your career. This is how courts, churches, and companies alike sometimes protect themselves, not by banning excess, but by hosting it. The presence of Lucrezia, again reported, disputed, has magnetized imaginations for centuries. Was she a willing sophisticate, a pawn seated like a jeweled statue to signal dynastic calm, or simply a woman who learned long ago that survival sometimes means being in a room you would rather pass by? Our script leaves the question open because the sources leave it open. We show a silhouette at the room's margin. We do not assign motive. As the night leans toward dawn, the room cools. The game loses its shine. The performers tire. The rich grow sleepy and generous in the same breath. Servants gather what the guests have dropped. Gloves, favors, promises. A final round of prizes is distributed. Candles are pinched to smoke. A door closes softly the way a secret does. What did Rome know the next morning? Not everything, but enough. In a city built of stairs, information travels downhill, from footmen to cooks to porters to grooms to tradesmen to neighbors to tavern tables to embassies. By week's end, men in other capitals were telling the story in letters politely devoid of adjectives and privately bristling with them. Whether exaggerated or not, the tale fit the Borgia reputation so snugly that it hardly needed proof to do its work. And the chestnuts, they graduated from winter snack to emblem. You cannot choose your symbols, sometimes they choose you. Rome would remember them not for warmth on a cold street, but for rolling on a palace floor under too much light. Institutions are great engines for turning nights into narratives. Once the story left the palace, it traveled by letter. The diplomatic pouch, the hurried dispatch, the ciphered paragraph that would be decoded in a northern court by a secretary who raised his eyebrows and reached for more wax. Even those who distrusted the Borgia's enemies found themselves circling the same truth. Perception rules politics. If a pope is rumored to watch while lines are crossed, reformers need only point. They don't need to prove, they only need to narrate. Alexander did not fold. He rarely did. If anything, he leaned further into the project of securing a Borgia future. He minted favor with one hand and justice with the other, convinced that order could keep reputation at bay. Rome continued to function because Rome always does. Masses were said, taxes collected, petitions answered on Tuesdays, but the chatter never cooled. In an age that would soon sharpen its knives for theological debates, a night of worldly rumor proved more persuasive at dinner tables than any scholastic argument. Then, in 1503, the machinery jolted. Alexander VI sickened and died. Malaria is the sober diagnosis most often given. Poison remains the rumor that refuses to die because it is shaped like a story. Whatever the cause, the effect was immediate. The keystone left the arch. Cesare's position, assembled from French alliances, papal favours, and his own steel, sagged in the middle. Rivals who had smiled at him now smiled through him. Cities recalculated. Captains hedged. The velvet became sandpaper. The body of a prince is one thing. The body of his power is another. Cesare tried to move faster than collapse. He made deals as he always had, clever, temporary, braced by nerve, but fortune, which had often cooperated, now multitasked elsewhere. Wounds, arrests, and shipwrecks entered the ledger. Exile followed like a shadow no lantern can push away. He died in 1507 in Navarre, Spain, fighting not as a crowned master but as the most dangerous thing a captain can be. A good soldier with too little state. Back in Rome, a new pope, Julius II, took the chair with a soldier's jaw and a patron's eye. He distanced himself from the Borgia aura with both policy and architecture. He refused the Borgia apartments, as many sources summarize it, and commissioned Raphael to paint rooms above, those luminous stanzi that still draw breath from tourists who don Tino or don't care what happened in the chambers below. It was more than interior design. It was a gesture, a reset in plaster and pigment, doctrine wrapped in art, art wrapped around reputation, reputation tasked with forgetting. Did the so-called Banquet of Chestnuts cause the Reformation? No. Movements are rivers fed by many streams, theology, money, politics, printing, pain. But the tale of one night, true in every detail or true in the large strokes only, armed critics with an image they could carry into sermons and pamphlets. The image did not argue, it accused. Even Catholics tasked with cleaning house in the Counter-Reformation understood the assignment, end the rumor by making a better truth. Seminaries were founded, clerical discipline tightened. Ceremonies were choreographed to broadcast dignity and mute improvisation. Spectacle didn't end, it was tamed. In the private record, some courtesans likely counted the night as work and went on to other clients in other palaces. Some churchmen folded the memory into silence and let it keep them company when promotion felt heavy. Servants kept the best memories of all, specific, unprintable, stubbornly human. Power passed to other families, other names. Rome changed outfits and kept walking. Walk the Vatican today and you'll feel, beneath the marble shine, the hum of decisions layered one over another like varnish. In a gallery where Raphael's School of Athens spills philosophy across plaster, you can almost hear brushes scratching, scaffolds creaking, a new century telling itself that beauty can mend what behavior broke. Perhaps it can, perhaps it can only distract. Either way, pilgrims stand and stare. Their guide whispers dates. Their cameras click. A guard coughs. Somewhere on a nearby street, a vendor roasts chestnuts in winter. The smell spirals up, thin and sweet. Rome chooses its memories. The rest become stories. The rest become warnings. Morning comes to Rome like an alibi. The bells ring as they always do. The city opens its shutters. Pilgrims join the slow current toward altars. Whatever happened behind a door the night before, lavish supper, tame diversion, or the banquet as some would later style it, doesn't stop the calendar. Yet something in the air feels reordered. Stories have mass. They settle into rooms, and the people who use those rooms learn to move around them. For Pope Alexander VI, momentum was the chosen answer. He continued the project he had always favored: secure the family, fortify the state, make Tuesday justice predictable. But power has a way of writing footnotes even as it speaks in the main text. Letters carried the tale of that autumn night outward by discreet stages, from servants' recollections to diplomatic summaries. The truth was contested. The effect wasn't. Critics of papal luxury now had an image simple enough to stick: candles, courtiers, chestnuts on marble, and images travel better than arguments. Then the shock that ends all strategies, 1503, and Alexander is gone. The sober explanation reads, fever, Likely malaria. The dramatic rumor reads poison. Either way, the machinery that made a Borgia future go round lost its engine. Cesare, who had written maps into shape, suddenly discovered how quickly a principality can revert to a geography lesson. Allies recalculated. Enemies returned to the table like guests who had been waiting in the next room. A man famous for speed met problems that would not move. He died a few years later in Spain, hard to the end, useful to someone else's war. The family that had seemed to fill the skyline became a line in other people's histories. Institutions outlived their operators by learning to choose symbols. Julius II, warrior pope, builder, impatient patron, chose a new set. He avoided the Borgia apartments and raised his court a floor, commissioning Raphael to flood fresh rooms with clear light and classical calm. It was a statement in plaster: if scandal is theatre, art can be counter-theatre. No decree was posted in the courtyard announcing a moral revolution. None was needed. Visitors walked up a stair and felt the message in their necks as they tilted their heads. Dignity would now be choreographed, not improvised. Beyond decor, the wider church did what large institutions do when reputation pinches: it made structures. In the generations that followed, reforms tightened clerical discipline, raised educational standards, and regularized training, seminaries, visitations, rules that put accountability in writing. These changes were driven by many forces: theology refined in councils, the shock of competing ideas, the pressures of politics and print. A lurid story from 1501 did not cause the new order, but it helped frame what needed to be left behind. If you want to change a culture, you give the old culture a name and a picture. Borgia excess became both. And yet the record won't stay simple. Take Lucrezia. For centuries she appeared either as a villain taught by men or a saint ruined by them. Then other documents complicated the caricature: a capable duchess in Ferrara, a patron, a survivor who learned to make a life in the thin space allowed her. Take Burchard's diary. Its flat tone convinced many that the scenes occurred as listed. Other scholars warned of later edits, slips of transmission, or the temptation to trust a narrative that fits a prejudice too neatly. All good history lives with that tension: enough certainty to speak, enough doubt to keep from shouting. So, what do we conclude besides the obvious? That power dressed in sanctity can cause lasting harm when it forgets why it is dressed at all. First, spectacle is a policy, not a pastime. Rulers stage scenes to bind allies and test loyalties. If you were in that room, whatever exactly the room contained, you were part of a circle that owed each other silence. Second, trust is a finite resource. Devotion can survive a leader's private sins for a while. It rarely survives the sense that hypocrisy is official. Third, reform without structure dissolves. Alexander's grief after Giovanni's murder briefly aimed at renewal, then drained into business as usual because nothing held it in place. Later, leaders learned that repentance has to be engineered into habits if it is to outlast a mood. There is a personal lesson too, buried under the marble. Most people in this story are not saints or monsters. They are talented, frightened, ambitious, loyal to the wrong thing at the wrong time, or simply tired in the wrong moment. A captain bends the knee out of prudence. A diplomat edits a letter so as not to lose his post. A young woman smiles in a room that treats her as furniture and chooses later to become more than the room intended. Even the Pope, for all the architecture of his will, weeps like any father over a dead son. History is not a morality play. It is a ledger of choices made under pressure. Walk the Vatican now, and the motifs still present themselves. In a chapel, incense climbs in clean spirals, allowing the modern nose to remember what devotion smells like. In a corridor, a candle gutters in a quiet side altar. The small, unstable light, whose weakness first made us human enough to gather, In a winter street, a vendor tosses chestnuts in a pan until their skins split and steam carries a sweetness up into cold air. Each object is harmless in itself. What we attach to it is on us. The same chestnut can warm a pilgrim's hands or roll as a prop in a room where people test what they should have feared to test. If our story has a last word, it is not about salacity. It is about stewardship. Institutions that carry other people's hopes must handle power as if it were borrowed, because it is. Even when a leader is brilliant, even when he can deliver order to a violent city, the bill for using a sacred office as a family instrument comes due. Sometimes it is paid in public confidence, sometimes in blood, sometimes in the quiet work required of the next generation to convince the world that the robe is more than a costume. So the night, whatever it truly contained, becomes a mirror. One viewer sees only gossip. Another sees a proof text for prejudice. A third sees the familiar mechanics of complicity and decides to count rooms, budgets, and private calendars differently in the institutions he loves, so they do not become rooms that need forgetting. Perhaps that is the only redemption history offers. Not the power to change what happened, but the pressure to behave better with what we hold now. The candle that lit our beginning has nearly burned to the dish. The smoke rises and disappears into frescoes where philosophers and saints still argue in paint about the nature of the good. The marble stays cool. The story cools with it, and the chestnuts, gathered long ago from a disputed floor, keep their double life, humble food and heavy symbol, reminding us that the distance between calling and appetite is small unless we make it large every ordinary day. If this episode gave you a clearer lens on power and image, like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves Renaissance history or modern organizational drama. Your support helps us make researched, respectful storytelling that doesn't trade truth for clicks. If you were Johannes Burchard, would you record everything, knowing it could outlive you and endanger others? Or would you close the book? Why? Do you think public spectacle is ever a legitimate governing tool, or does it always corrode trust? Share a modern example. Does art, like Raphael's rooms, truly repair reputation, or just repaint it? Where do you see reset by aesthetics today? Which figure here feels most misunderstood? Alexander, Cesare, or Lucrezia? Defend your pick with one piece of evidence.